Okay, so last week we started a new Mishnah, which I want to briefly repeat and just summarize the Gemara because we're going forward, and this is a very, very interesting Gemara. Really, halachically, it's Nogea, although, as we said last week, there seems to be a little disparity between our Mishnah and the halacha. We'll talk about that, but it gets quite complicated, actually, interwoven in the discussion. So I don't know how far we'll get into that discussion, but let's at least summarize where we are so that everybody is sort of up to speed. All right. So the Mishnah itself, and the subject is ono. Ono, as we said, is price fraud, which we've discussed a number of times, and the major impact of price fraud, as we've discussed it, is 1/6. In other words, if the price of an item is sold more or less than 1/6 of what is considered to be its value, again through appraisals and other things, that's called ono. And as we said last week, there's a discussion in the Gemara, and actually a machlokes, as to what to do with that 1/6. In other words, let's just back up. If you sell something for less than 1/6, up or down, meaning seller benefit, buyer benefit, less than 1/6, that's considered, for our purposes right now, let's just say that's waived. There is no ono, there's no issue. The Gemara gets into that, but let's just say for our purposes, to make it easy, no ono. If it is substantially more than 1/6 either way, then the actual sale is, we call it voidable because it doesn't have to be voided, but it is voidable by both sides. So in other words, the extremes on either side, easy to understand. If it's exactly 1/6, this is where there is a machlokes. According to our Mishnah, the person who is affected by the fraud, meaning buyer or seller, has an option. The option is to get a refund of the amount of the discrepancy, right? And then go on, or void the deal. It's up to him. It's up to him whether to void the deal or just to take the money and say, I want the deal. According to the halacha, that's our Mishnah. According to the halacha outside of the Mishnah, and we'll understand why the Mishnah is different. According to halacha outside of the Mishnah, you can't void the sale. The only option for the defrauded party is to get his money. So in other words, if it was 1/6 more, then the buyer can get his money. If it was 1/6 less, the seller can get his money, but neither can void the sale. That's the halacha. The Mishnah allows the defrauded party the option of getting the money or voiding the sale. We're going to have to discuss why the Mishnah is different than the halacha, because in this Mishnah there happens to be that discrepancy. It's very unusual, but that is the case. So now we have a whole full picture of what ono is, when it applies, when it doesn't apply.
Rabbi,
Go ahead.
Rabbi, sorry to interrupt, but just to be sure, if it's more than 1/6, you said it's voidable, not void ab initio.
The parties can still say we want to make the deal, but just give us our money.
So not to politicize the Shiur, because that's in Rabbi Hyatt's memory, but a certain former president who's now on trial, if none of the people that did business with him say we have an issue with anything that took place, then from I guess from a halakhic point of view, everything's fine.
Right. The issue of public policy, the issue of
right, all that other stuff.
And all these other things.
Between the buyer and the seller or the lender, etc. If they say we're fine with everything that took place, that's it. The deal is fine. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Right. So in other words, yes, then we just go on and you make the restitution of the 6, make the restitution. Now, the case where it's voidable is the case where it's more than 1/6. In other words, if it's just 1/6, then it's a machlokes between the Mishnah and the halacha, what you can do, whether you can void it or just get your money. What Yael is talking about, where it's voidable, is when it's more than 1/6. So when it's more than a sixth, then everybody can say, forget about the deal. We don't like the whole situation. We're moving on. Or they can say, hey, we really want to make this deal. Let's just forget about the public policy of what happened, and just let's make the money, make it work, pay whatever you have to pay, and move on. But the point is that either side can say that, not just the defrauded side, but the other fellow on the other side can say as well, you know what, my bad, I don't want to make the deal. So he has that right as well. Okay, that's the situation of what we understand as shtus. Shtus meaning a six. Now, the Mishnah also said, and this was different than anything we discussed.
Rabbi,
Okay.
I didn't follow what Yale was getting at in terms of over-evaluating is not the same thing as a sale, right? I'm missing something from what Yale said and as well as the answer. If somebody overvalues something and you still want to make the deal, then it can go through, right?
Of course, because the
Don't
sides
collect any money on that one.
but Jay, because there you're talking about maybe something intangible. Someone says, I'll overpay because I want this item, or I'll overpay because I want this field. That happens all the time. People say, I'd rather overpay and get something. That's not a shtus related issue. The issue is when you don't know and you were defrauded because you didn't know, and you wouldn't have paid that amount if you knew. Right? If you knew, I wouldn't overpay if I knew.
Right.
That's where this whole fraud.
He was referring to evaluation.
Evaluation, correct.
Not sales.
That's not a sale. That's not a sale. But he was taking the subject matter and drawing a parallel to something outside of it and asking a generic question whether or not. And the answer is that the parties can always override the halacha, because the halacha is there to protect them. But if they say, you know what, I don't need protection, I know what I'm doing. Okay, the halacha is meant where someone was defrauded sort of surreptitiously and didn't know that he was paying, or the seller may have said, oh, what a terrible mistake, I undersold by so much money. That's only in the case where they didn't know.
But evaluations is not the same as a sale.
No, evaluation is not the same.
Evaluates to lend money. That's not the same category as what we're talking about in the Gemara.
That's not shtus. No, that's absolutely not. That's correct. All right. So now having said what we just said about shtus, we're reviewing the Mishnah. Then we had another man d'Amar of the Mishnah who gave us a big chiddush, and that's very important for our understanding of the Gemara later. And he said, you know what? Shtus is not a sixth. Shtus is a third. Remember, we said Rav Tarfon said that ono is shmona kesef me'esrim v'arba sela, eight pieces of silver out of 24. That's a third. So if there's a big difference between a third and a sixth, so according to him, it's a third. So the Gemara says that, you know what? So, okay, that's the machlokes. The Mishnah also tells us, and this is important, how do you come to grips with the ono? Because it's not an open-ended story. So the Mishnah says, in the beginning of the Mishnah, Ad kedei sheyar l'tager l'krovo. You know the time limit that you have to undo a fraudulent sale of a shtus, is the time that you need to go to an expert, an appraiser, or to your relatives, have a discussion, and let them give you some feedback, because you did this on your own. You didn't ask anybody's opinion. Now you want to get an opinion, and they say, you know what, you seriously overpaid. Oh, you got a fantastic deal, you underpaid. Or the seller goes and says that I sell for too little money. So the Mishnah tells us Ad kedei sheyir l'tager or l'krovo, until he shows it to his relatives or to an expert, an appraiser. All right, that's the Mishnah. Now, in the case of Rav Tarfon, he said 1 and 3. So then the Mishnah tells us v'samchu tagre lud, that the appraisers, the experts in Lud, were very, very happy. Why? Because all of a sudden it wasn't 1/6 that gets you into trouble. It has to be a third. So in other words, the Tagrei Lud said, okay, now we can sort of, I'm not sure they were intentionally doing this, but they're saying that now that it's a third, there's so much more leeway for us to do business because between a third and a sixth, between those two numbers, there's no oh no, there's no price for it. So all of a sudden the Tagrei Lud were very, very happy with Rav Tarfon's ruling. Says the Mishnah, but Rav Tarfon added one point to his ruling, and he said, however, in order to make it a level playing field, I'm allowing kol hayom mutar lachzor, that the entire day, or whether it's 24 hours, but let's say a day, the entire day of the transaction, the parties can withdraw from or undo the transaction. Having said that, then all of a sudden the Tagrei Lud, who were overjoyed by Rav Tarfon's view, said, you know what? Thank you, Rav Tarfon, but we're going back to the Chachamim, and we're holding like the Tanakama, the Rabbanan, who said that it's a sixth, and you have this limited window. In other words, faced between the question of a sixth versus a third, but in a sixth, you have the time that it takes to get an expert opinion, which could be a day or two. I mean, in other words, again, there is an objective terminology for that. We don't know exactly what that is, but it's not the snap of a finger. Whereas Rav Tarfon says, you know what? I'm giving you the entire day, and apparently the entire day is too much time for them. It's too much time to undo the deal, even though it is a third. Shnus is a third, not a sixth. So they said, you know, thank you, Rabbi Tarfon. We're going back to the original svara of Shtus, which is a sixth, and you have to get an expert opinion. And again, the presumption is maybe an expert opinion takes an hour or two or whatever, but less than a day. So now you have the contrasting views, which again, our Gemara is going to discuss that in more detail. But for our purposes, Shtus is either, according to the Tanakama, 1/6, and you have the amount of time that it takes to go to your relative or to an expert appraiser to get a answer. And without telling us in the Mishnah directly, we can extrapolate that that's a small window. In other words, you go right to the appraiser and he reviews it and he tells you an answer. So it may take only an hour. Again, we don't have an exact number, but that's kind of what the picture is painted. And then you have the Rav Tarfon, who says, no, a shtus is 1/3. And with that 1/3, you have a limitation of 1 day to back out. And now the question is, what would you rather have? Who would you rather paskin like? The Tanakama that it's a sixth and get whatever the time is to get an expert, or a third and have a day, a full day, whatever that means, makalayom, to do it. That's the discussion in the Mishnah. And again, no one gives an opinion. No one gives a final resolution. But that's the machlokes, and we see that from those who were very pleased with Rav Tarfon's view, once they heard you had a day, they said not so fast. We'd rather have the rabbi's view with a sixth and the limitation of going to a expert. That's how the Mishnah concludes. And again, we have to think back to the times of the Mishnah and what kind of dealings people were having. You can't impose our time today to say that's what it should be. Because again, today we have super quick ways of checking, especially on the computer or contacting through Google or whatever, or you can go online and get an expert opinion online within a matter of minutes. So again, our times are a little bit different maybe than the time there. Maybe it took more time for someone to go to the next town to get an expert. There wasn't an expert where you were. It was like a small village. So we can't sort of pinpoint the exact situation, but you get the picture. Is that's what the discussion was. That's
so Tarfon's answer is really quite revolutionary. He's doubling the time allowed to doubling the value the
doubling the value,
overcharging.
but perhaps shortening the time dramatically because it may take 2 days to get a expert opinion according to the Tanakama.
Right, but I'm saying that it's not even balanced. Doubling the amount of money is much more. It's not comparable to just giving more hours of the day or a day and a half, whatever it is. The doubling of the money allows so much fraud to take place.
Correct.
To a third. I mean, that's a tremendous 33% overcharging is a lot more than just a sixth. In terms of the whole commerce would allow so much overcharging. It just seems too far. You know, it's 100% over the Chachamim, the 1/6. I mean, if it was 10% or 20% more,
right. So take a look. We said last week the very last Rashi of the Mishnah section before the Gemara. Look at what Rashi says. V'samchu tagre lud. The appraisers of Lud were very happy with Rav Tarfon. Why? They were Bekiyim. They were real experts, Umochrim Beyoker, and they sold it for a higher price. So, in other words, those folks knew the ins and outs, and they sold it for a higher price because the discrepancy for a oinah was much greater according to Rav Tarfon. So they, between a third and a sixth, they could make so much profit and not be violating of oinah, right?
That's why. So why would anybody want to accept Rav Tarfon's view? Why would all of these people? Because the public's being ripped off by a tremendous amount. You get to
understood, but in context, Rav Tarfon was a very, very big paisik. He was very established, and of course, in the time of the Mishnah, this was a Tanoim. In the time of the Mishnah, again, most people didn't have independent means. So they looked, okay, what am I allowed to do? What am I allowed to do? Not allowed to do. So Rav Tarfon in his community, he was a Besed Mensch. He was surrounded by people who maybe did higher, more advanced business, whatever. So he looked at it from the lens of the people he dealt with, and he said, these folks, they're allowed to do business with a third being the marker as opposed to a sixth, and all the people who were surrounding Rav Tarfon, who held Rav Tarfon was their paisik, they were overjoyed because he gave them a much bigger leeway to do business. But because he added the caveat that, but you know what, I'm giving you a bigger opportunity, but at the same time you have a bigger achraya, so I've got to give the other people some balance. What's the balance? You have a full day to back out. Then they said, oh, wait a minute, a full day, that's way too much time for us to wait to see if a deal is done. So they said, you know what, we'd rather have a smaller window, quote unquote, of profit, but a quicker resolution to the problem in their mind. In other words, they felt that under the Tanakama, the resolution of getting to an appraiser or to your relatives was quicker than a day. That's the only thing we can surmise. Otherwise, why would they be unhappy with a day? If the Tanakama gave them 2-3 days, then 1 day is a godsend, right? Teretz is that 1 day must have been too long. According to the Tanakama, it was much quicker. I would have thought maybe because it takes a longer time to consult with an expert or consult with your relatives. But Mistama not. Mistama, in the context of the Mishnah, a day was way too long for them to wait to see if a deal was done. So they immediately flipped over. Now, this becomes very important. I'm emphasizing this because once we get deep into the Gemara, you're going to see the importance of what I'm saying about Rav Tarfon's view and the Tanakama's view. It makes a big difference. So let's accept that, and then we'll go further. So now, that was the Mishnah. So we've now reviewed the Mishnah. Let's just review the beginning of the Gemara that we started next week, and then we can pick up, because again, this is very important. So the Gemara tells us that there is a machlokes Rav and Shmuel, two of the great Amoraim. They have a machlokes in what does a sixth mean, okay? And again, now we're starting to sort of parse their words. And the Gemara tells us that there's a machlokes and what does six mean. According to Rav, A sixth means a sixth of the value. So let's take the case of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that oino is four pieces of silver within 24 within a seller. A seller has 24 pieces of silver, and if you upcharge or downcharge, whatever that word is, more or less of 4, then that is 1/6 of the value of 24, and that's I know. So in our minds, it's pretty clear. 4 divided into 24 is 6. So if the upcharge is 4 saloim, or the downcharge, if you call it that, is 4 saloim, or to Rav, simple, that's I know. Now, what does it mean it's I know? So according to our interpretation of the Mishnah, you are allowed to void the sale or get your money back. According to the halacha, outside of the Mishnah, you can only get your money back. You can't void the sale. You can only void the sale if let's say it was 5 pieces of silver out of 24. That's more than a 6. Then everybody, okay, no deal. Then in other words, anybody can void the deal. But if it's only 4, says the Mishnah, it's up to the defrauded party to get your money back and move on, or cancel the deal. According to the actual halacha, then you can actually cancel the deal. All right, that's Rav. Rav is pretty straightforward. Comes Shmuel, and Shmuel says, Rav, I agree with you. If it's 1/6 of the value, that's I know. But I'm going to add another layer to I know. And I'm going to say not only 1/6 of the value, but also 1/6 of the amount of money that you're paying. So again, we can strain in our minds what that means. The Gemara is going to tell us, so I don't want to take too much time here, but he's adding that 1/6 is not only 1/6 of value, but it's 1/6 of the money. Now, how do we distinguish that? So let's go right to what the Gemara told us last week. Okay, so they gave us 2 examples in the Gemara. In other words, one example was if you had an item that was worth 6 zuzim, right? In other words, 6 pieces of silver, called a zuzim, and you sold it for 5. So according to Rav, right, that's I know. Because why? Because the 1/6 is I know. According to Shmuel, that's not 1/6, that's 1/5. Think about it. You sold something for 5. 1 of 5 is 20%, not 1 of 6, which is 1/6 according to Rav, but it's 1 of 5, and that's 20%. That's not even I know anymore. That's way overcharging, and there isn't the question of I know. Now, what about the other way around? Something was worth 7. Now, who was defrauded in that case? In that case, the seller was defrauded because he undersold himself. He sold for 5 something that should have been in 6. Now, what about something that is 7? It's worth 7, and you sold it for 6, means you undersold it, right? So who was defrauded? The buyer was defrauded. So according to Rav, that's not a 6th anymore. Therefore, no or no, because it's too small to be considered. Remember, if it's under a 6, the way we're looking at it right now, it's irrelevant. It's a throwaway because you're not really hurt if it's less than a 6. But according to Shmuel, it's 1/6. It's 1/6 because it's 1 of 6 sloim. So according to Rav, there would be no I know. According to Shmuel, who agrees with Rav that valuation is one way of looking at it, it could be a no, but it's certainly not a no of money. It's only a no of value. So in other words, Shmuel doesn't disagree with Rav that valuation is important. And therefore, if the value is 1 of 6, that's I know. The only machlokes is if it's not 1/6, but only 1/5. According to Rav, 1/5 is an automatic termination of the deal if the parties want, but it's an automatic termination. And according to Shmuel, it's oino'ah. And oino'ah is what we said before. According to the Mishnah, you have a choice. According to the halacha, you have no choice, but you only get the money back. So what did the Gemara say? That the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel is in the following instance, okay? If something was worth 5 zuzim, right? And you sold it for 6, so you defrauded the buyer, then in that particular case, what does Rav say? If you paid 6 for something that was 5, then that's not 1/6, right? It's more than a 6. But now what about if you sold something that was 7 and you sold it for 6? So the seller was the one who was underpaid. According to Shmuel, says the Gemara, since we go after the money, not the valuation, right? We go after the money. Both of those cases are ono. According to Rav, only one case is ono. The case of if you something worth 5 and you sold for 6, right? That's ono. But the other way around, 7 for 6 is not ono. According to Shmuel, they're both ono because both of them are more than 1/6 of the amount of money. Now, so in the pecking order, according to Rav, you always go according to the valuation. According to Shmuel, you have to have, in order for it not to be ono, you have to have neither ono of value or ono of money. If you have one or the other, it's ono. So Shmuel is more machmir by saying that we're introducing ono of money on top of ono of value, because according to Rav, it's pretty straightforward. According to Shmuel, you can have a case of ono, which according to Rav is not ono. And since you have to have, in order for it not to be ono according to Shmuel, it has to be both not ono of value or ono of money. So according to Shmuel, it's more likely to be ono than according to Rav. That's the landscape that we sort of painted last week. That's the machlokes. So if you hold that it's ono of value, which Rav and Shmuel agree with, okay, simple, do the valuation. Is there 1/6 of the value? If it's less, then it's a throwaway. No or no. If it's more, then it's clearly beyond. And if it's exact, it's a no. But according to the circumstance where there is no ono of value, but there is ono of money, then Rav steps away. And he says, oh, no, I don't hold for my no of money. To me, ono of money doesn't have any real value. But according to Shmuel, ono of money counts. And therefore, he says, in order for something to not be ono, there has to be no ono of value and of money. If either appears, then it's ono. So definitely Shmuel is more machmir than Rav about what is considered ono. And that will sort of, now today, we're going to see how that all plays out. So if that's clear, then we're going to go now to today's Gemara. And the Gemara is going to try to bring a raya that Shmuel is right. Shmuel is right and not Rav. So let's start in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Tanan. This is about a little bit more than halfway of the wide lines. A little bit more than halfway down of the wide lines. The Gemara says as follows. Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, this is our Mishnah actually. Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, if a person does price fraud, in other words, overcharges 4 kesef, 4 zuzin out of 24, right? Then shtus lemekach. This is the classic case which we said of ono, 1/6 of the value of the entire thing, and then it's ono. Now, so the Gemara is going to hypothecate what's the facts of our case. Again, the Gemara is giving us what they assume are the facts of our case, and let's analyze it. My love, don't you think that when the Mishnah says 1 and 24, it means the following: Shavei esrim be'esrim v'arba. Again, this is the hypothesis. Don't you think we're talking about an item that's actually worth only 20 zuz, and you sold it for 24? So you actually sold it for 24, but it was worth 20. So who did you defraud? You defrauded the buyer, right? So the buyer overpaid. But what did he overpay? He overpaid by a fifth, right? Because it was worth 20. He paid 24, so he overpaid 4 over 20 is 20%, a fifth, not a sixth, right? It is a sixth of the total amount that was paid, but in terms of zuzim, of actual money, he overpaid 20%. And the Mishnah, Ushma mino shtus mos namishoninu, and the Mishnah says that that's considered shtus. Isn't that a raya to Shmuel? So in other words, based on the fact pattern that the Mishnah is saying they believe the Mishnah is talking about, it's clearly a raya to Shmuel that what? That shtus is even a fifth. In other words, not that you overpaid and you have a right to void the deal. No, it's a shtus. And again, in the Mishnah's parlance, shtus is an either or. You can either walk away or not. But in halachic terms, you can't walk away. When it's an exact shtus, you have to, you can't walk away. So in the case that the Mishnah gives us the hypothesis where it was worth 20 and you're selling for 24, the overpayment is 20%, right? 1/5, not 1/6. And that's exactly what Shmuel says is the case we're talking about. So the Chayra, our Mishnah is a raya to Shmuel's opinion. Rav's opinion goes without saying that it's a sixth, but even when it's a fifth, because it's a fifth of money, Shmuel says it's only a shtus. It's not necessarily overpayment. It's a shtus where you can just repay and walk away. That's the Gemara's kasha here, or that's what the Gemara wants to say is a proof to Shmuel. Our own Mishnah says the Gemara, lo. That's not a proof because you've got the case wrong. It's not a case of it's worth 20 and you overpaid to 24. It's the other way around. It's a case where the valuation was 24 and you paid you underpaid by 4. So when you underpaid by 4, it's a 6. Shmuel's interpretation never comes to play because Shmuel agrees with Rav that 1/6 of value is shtus, but he wants to say that it's also 1/6 of money. This case is not about 1/6 of money. It's only about a case of value because the item was worth 24, you underpaid 20, so you can't say a fifth. You have to say it's a sixth. So therefore, says the Gemara, it's no raya to Shmuel. It's in the semantics of what the case is talking about. If it's in a case of upcharging from 20 to 24, then you can see where the raya is to Shmuel, that even if it's a fifth, that can be considered a no. But the Gemara says, no, it's no raya to Shmuel, because that's not the case. The case of our Mishnah, where it talks about 24 zuz, is a case where it was worth 24. The seller undersold it for 20, undersold it for 20. So who is being hurt here? The seller is being hurt, and therefore the Mishnah says, you know what? That's a shtus. It's 1/6 of the value, and you're allowed to undo the deal. No raya to Shmuel. Okay.
Rabbi, just a clarification.
Go ahead, Mike.
I thought we learned last week that Shmuel is more stringent
Yes.
than Rav.
Yes.
That in Shmuel's case, it's either that it's 1/6 of the value or 1/6 of the amount paid. Either one, if it's 1/6 or greater,
Right,
it is shtus. So in the case of 20 versus 24, he would agree on either, Shmuel would agree on either count if it was 4 on 24, which was the price paid,
right,
it would be 1/6. And if it was
right.
4 on 20, it's 1/5, which is greater than 1/6.
Correct.
So either way, it would have been
Yes, right. Right. So, but if that's the fact pattern, then that's a proof to Shmuel, because Rav is out of the picture here because he only holds a sixth of value, so he would not weigh in on this whole question.
But in the case of where it was 24 and he only paid 20, it still would be a violation from Shmuel's perspective, because
Because of valuation, not
right,
because of money.
right.
Right. So
So he
that's all.
agrees that it would be a violation there as well, because the 4 down 4 on 24
Is a
is
six.
still 1/6.
Right, but the point of the Gemara is you can't bring a raya that Shmuel is correct in his interpretation, because our Mishnah never talks about shtus of money, only shtus of value. So that's what the Gemara is trying to tell us.
But you
You
can't
wanted to
prove
bring a
that he's
raya.
not, but you can't prove that he's not right either,
No,
because
you can't prove the negative, but you can't prove the positive that
right.
Shmuel is right, because the Mishnah doesn't talk about Shmuel's case of money.
So far we don't have proof. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. We don't have proof. You know how the Gemara operates, Michael. The Gemara, after we learn something, the Gemara says, I'm going to bring a raya that Shmuel is right. Why? Because the Mishnah tells us Shmuel is right. But if you look at the Mishnah doesn't tell us Shmuel is right, because it only talks about value, not money. So we're still left with, oh, Shmuel says that, but how do we know he's right? So we have to find a way that he's right. Okay, all right. So, and that's typical of the Gemara. We see that again and again.
The only thing I was trying to say is it doesn't prove Shmuel is wrong. It
Right.
just yet
It
doesn't prove that he's
wrong.
right.
Right. In other words, you need a de jure act to show he's right. You can't just say, oh, de facto, because there's no de facto here, because we're not talking about money, we're talking about value. Okay, so we agree. So now, so what's the teretz? The teretz is what we just said. And in the case of the Gemara, now this is important, in the case of the Gemara where we're talking about it was 24 and he sold it for 20, who is being defrauded? The scenario is where the seller is being defrauded. The seller is being defrauded because he's charging less than what he should charge. Now the Gemara is going to have an interesting question. You want to tell me that this sugya is about the seller being defrauded? That's not the case. It has nothing to do with the seller. It has to do with the buyer. Take a look. Says the Gemara, Minis anem mocher, is the seller the one who's being defrauded, which he is according to this fact pattern. A Seifa. Look at the Seifa of our Mishnah. What was the Seifa of our Mishnah? The Seifa of the Mishnah was, the Mishnah asked, how much time do you have to back out? Ad Mosai, says the Gemara, mutar lahachzer, answers the Gemara, yaret l'teger or l'chavero. The amount of time it takes to go to the appraiser or to his relative is the amount of time you have to back out. Okay, now this Gemara, by the way, that goes into all of this we're going to learn that in a couple of weeks. It's on Daf Nunal. V'Amar Rav Nachman, in there in that Gemara Nunal, Rav Nachman says, Lo shani ela lokeach. The caveat of having to go to an expert or to a relative applies only to a buyer, right? A seller can always back out. It's an uneven process. According to Rav Nachman, in the later Gemara, we're going to see that when the seller makes a mistake, he has unlimited time to come back. The buyer is defrauded, he has a limited time. But we'll discuss the imbalance later. But let's just accept that that's the case, that the buyer has the benefit of going to an expert or to his relative. Therefore, if he does that, he can undo the deal. If he breaks that window, tough luck. The seller has no such limitation according to Rav Nachman. So therefore, in the sefer of our Mishnah, who are we talking about? Only the buyer, right? The sefer, where it talks about going to an expert, deals with the buyer. Frek the Gemara Kasha. How can you say, you want to slug up the raya, Michael, that we just gave, that it's not about Shmuel? Why? Because we're dealing with a case where it was 24 and he sold it for 20, and therefore there's no raya to Shmuel. Who was defrauded in that case? The mocher, the seller. But wait a minute, we're not talking about when the mocher is defrauded, because the sefer is talking only about when the buyer is defrauded. So why are you mixing apples and oranges? You're bringing a raya in the first part of the Mishnah that it's not talking about Shmuel's case. Why? Because the seller was defrauded when you sold from 24 to 20, right? The seller was the one who got the bad rap. But who cares about the seller? This whole Mishnah is about the buyer, because the sefer is talking about a limitation of tagor or chavero or krovo, and that can only apply to the buyer because the seller has an unlimited window to undo the deal. So forget about the seller. This is not about the seller. It's only about the buyer. So what are you telling me? There's no raya to Shmuel? That's wrong. Go ahead.
But Rabbi, I mean, an unlimited time, he may have already used the goods. I mean, are you going to go back a year later?
Yes,
and say,
we're going to understand later what that means. But yes, according to this scenario, even when he started using the goods, the seller can come back to him and said, I made a mistake. We have to undo the deal, which is unfair, right? I agree.
Can I ask a question that would solve this, but I don't know how, if the halacha would recognize this. Let's say the seller had an expert on call.
Right.
And that the buyer would have the option to consult with the expert who was independent, and the buyer would pay independently for that expert if they had a question. But otherwise, they'd have to go with what the amount was. Wouldn't that solve all problems? Because you would have the option. Then essentially the buyer would be saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to settle with what the value is, but I have the option if I want to get an expert on hand. I would be able to solve that. And wouldn't that mitigate any objection to this?
Well, again, so you're posing a scenario, which again, I'm not sure we can give a definitive answer, but we can say the following. So this is what we can say. Number one, if an expert is on hand and he's truly objective, not one that the buyer would object to because it's the seller's expert, right?
Well,
so
he's paid
now
by
you're
the
running into
buyer,
the nuance.
so he's representing the buyer, not the seller. He's representing the buyer.
Okay, so the buyer has to trust him. You're right, but Enochanami, if that expert was available to him in a very quick fashion and he relied on that expert, then that deal would be done or undone very quickly. There's no question that you're hypothecating a scenario that could work. The Gemara doesn't introduce it mistama, and I'm just probably because expert would not easily obtainable. In other words, you and I are in some village outside of Yerushalayim or Bava or wherever it happened to be, and we're making a transaction. And we do a transaction, and the buyer says to himself, you know what, I'm not sure that I wasn't taken here. So I want to take advantage of what the Tanakama says, and that is that I'm allowed to go to an expert. So now, where is that expert? He's either in the village, the next village, the city, whatever the timetable that was acceptable at the time of the Gemara. He went ahead and went to that expert. In your scenario, if the expert were really at hand, that would solve the problem. I agree. It would solve the problem because you'd be right away. You'd be able to make a determination. Now, that l'chayr would go both ways. You're right, because what happens if the seller says, "Wait a minute, I think I made a bad deal here. Let me go to the expert," and the expert happens to be sitting down the street. He could go to whether it's his expert or not. He'll go to the expert, and the expert will tell him, "You made a bad deal, or you didn't make a bad deal." But the Gemara, it seems like, in this scenario, is protecting the seller, says Rav Nachman, because a seller, and again, I'm not giving an opinion. Why should we protect the seller more than the buyer? We'll discover that in the discussion. But it seems like the seller has more leeway to undo the deal. And part of the reason may be because since it's the seller that is the catalyst for economic lifeblood of a community, right? Seller, you have to have a buyer, of course, but you have to have the sellers who are willing to sell. And so we're trying to protect the seller in case he made a mistake. We want to protect him, and therefore we give him more leeway. Is it fair or not, Michael? I'm not. That's not an opinion.
Rabbi, I just want to clarify. So if he signed an agreement, if the seller had on hand in the village an expert, okay, and he had them sign an agreement that independently you can verify this for a price to accept the deal, but that's what you're signing. If you don't, then you're going to agree to my terms, and there's no way to go back on it. Wouldn't that solve any machlokus about this?
Yes, I would agree with you that under the facts that you have presented, that would be the way to conclude. But the Gemara is obviously telling us that the reality is that an expert was not necessarily on hand, that experts were rare to find, that experts only lived in the big cities, but whatever you want to pick. So therefore, if the expert happened to be there under your terms, I agree 100%. The expert's there. Therefore, neither the buyer nor the seller is hurt more than the other by going to the expert. So the seller doesn't have an open window of days. He has an expert right there, and he'll consult with that expert. But what happens in the absence of an expert? Says the Gemara, in the absence of an expert, the seller, the weight is with the seller. The seller has more leeway than the buyer, and therefore it's the buyer who has to more quickly come to the table and say, this is a fair deal or not a fair deal. And because that's the case, says the Gemara here, therefore our Mishnah focuses only on the buyer, not on the seller. Now, if you focus only on the buyer, not the seller, then the answer we gave to shlug up Shmuel being the Tana of our Mishnah, in other words, that he is the proper interpretation, that objection now falls away, because the only reason why we said that Shmuel was not the Tana is because we gave an example of 24 and 20, but 24 and 20 is a seller mistake. And our Mishnah doesn't talk about a seller mistake. It only talks about a buyer mistake. So you, Gemara, who wanted to shlug up that our Mishnah is not like Shmuel, is wrong. Our Mishnah is like Shmuel. L'chayra, our Mishnah is a proof to Shmuel that what? That you can go by the monetary value, because we're talking about a buyer's mistake, not a seller's mistake, and therefore the Mishnah can come out according to Shmuel. That's what, in other words, the focus is not on your point, Michael. Your point is 100% correct. If there's an expert, no problem, deal is done, we're over. But in the Gemara scenario, there was no expert available. If there's no expert available, then what's the next best thing? Well, the Lakeach has a small window. The seller has a large window. Our Mishnah is talking about the buyers, not the sellers. If it's talking about the buyers, why are you slugging up the Mishnah that it can't come out like Shmuel? Because of a seller's mistake. We're not talking about sellers' mistakes. We're only talking about buyers' mistakes in this particular Mishnah. So that's l'chayra should be proof that our Mishnah holds like Shmuel. That's what the Gemara wants to say. Short of that,
Right, right.
yes, we can always hypothesize other things. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
I'm missing something. Before we had this meeting of a buyer and a seller, don't the Chachamim assume that both sides, a buyer or a seller, can go get an expert and determine what the value of something is? The seller certainly has more incentive to have his objects that he has for sale to have been checked out or certified or whatever, and both sides both sides have a lifeline in effect.
Right,
So the question is whether you have to use the lifeline or not.
right.
So I don't know why we got so deep into this. Usually you say the buyer beware. Here you have the same thing with the seller beware. I mean, the seller's not trying to lower prices. He's
Right.
trying to do the honest thing. If he's an honest businessman, he knows ahead of time what he paid for everything and what the markup can be to sell. The buyer the buyer may be a lot more ignorant than the seller is on any kind of transaction.
So
Why don't
let
we
me say this.
start with that point?
Yes, you're 100% right. L'chaira, we should be protecting the buyer more than the seller, because when a seller comes to market and he has produce, to your point, you would have thought he would have checked out, I have produce, what's the real value? I want to make money. I don't want to play around. So let me go into the market and sell and take my money and go home. That's what you would think would be the rationale of a seller. A buyer, he's somewhat ignorant. He's in business to produce widgets. He knows nothing about fruits and vegetables. Here he's going to buy fruits and vegetables from a seller. What does he know about fruits and vegetables? It seems to be weighted on the side of the seller. I would agree to that. So l'chaira, the question should be, and I think maybe you're asking that question, is it's the buyer who we should be protecting, because he doesn't do his homework. He doesn't go into the marketplace knowing what a tomato costs or what a cucumber costs. He goes in and he's assuming that, even the fair, that he's not going to be overcharged and that he's going to buy in the normal span. Now, if you go to Machane Yehuda and you walk down that aisle, you're going to know very quickly what the right price is, because you got 10 guys selling the same tomato. And if this guy's selling a tomato for 5 zuzim and he's selling it for 2, there's a problem. But we're talking about where the seller comes, every Thursday. I remember in Beersheba, the market was Thursday. So if you wanted to see a real shuk, you went to Beersheba on a Thursday morning. That's what we were told years and years ago. I don't know if it's still the case today. So you go down to the marketplace in Beersheba and it's teeming with Bedouins and with this and with that, and everybody's selling their ware. Now you come in and your head is spinning because you want to not overpay, but you see the tomatoes, the cucumbers, and rice, whatever else, and you don't have a knowledge. So says the Gemara, okay, in the general sense, that a shtus, let's call it according to Tanakama, a shtus is the marker by which we're considering it to be defrauding the buyer and the seller. If you really think about it, why are we protecting the seller? If we believe the seller comes with knowledge of forethought, is he going to not know that he can't sell his tomatoes for 20 zuzim when they're really 24? I mean, that's the real question. Why are we protecting him? L'chaira, he should know better, and he should be the one who has to sort of suffer the consequences. The Gemara is telling it's not the case. And unfortunately, we have to wait another blot or so to get into why we're protecting the seller. So we have to accept at face value that both are worthy of protection, the seller and the buyer. And the protection, according to Tanakama, is 1/6. So says the Gemara, and this is the Machlokes Rav and Shmuel, that if the buyer makes a mistake and he overpays by 1/6, depending on whether it's Rav or Shmuel, whether it's 1/6 of the value or 1/6 of the money, we protect him, but we give him a caveat that he can undo the deal if he remember that show, something about you phone a friend. So you go to your friend who's an
Wi-Fi.
appraiser, or you go to your friend who happens to be your relative, and you say, did I make a mistake here? And they come back and say yes or no. Then he comes back to the seller and says yes or no. Then the halacha is what it is. According to the Mishnah, if it's a 6, you either have the choice of undoing or getting your differential back. And according to the halacha outside of the Mishnah, you don't have to make a choice, you get your money back. You may get the deal is undone. So that's the sort of the scenario we're dealing with. Now, says the Gemara wants to bring a raya that Shmuel is the Manda Omar of our Mishnah, that you can shtus means 2 things, and it brings a good raya, because we see when you have 24 and you sell it for 20, then according to Rav, it's only the valuation, but according to Shmuel, it can also be a shtus of the money. Okay, fine. And then the halacha would be like Shmuel, not like Rav. Says the Gemara, no, that's not the case, because in our situation, it's not 20 to 24, which would be a raya. It's 24 to 20, and 24 to 20 can only be a 1/6 of the value. It can't be a 1/6 of the money. No Shmuel, not halacha. Correct the Gemara, if you're going to tell me that the case of our Mishnah is 24, and it was sold for 20, that's the fact pattern of our Mishnah, I have a problem. And therefore the halacha, you can't prove that the halacha is like Shmuel, I have a problem with that, because the Mishnah is unbalanced. If the Mishnah is talking about a buyer, it should stick to the buyer. If the Mishnah is talking about protecting the seller, it should talk about protecting the seller. The ratio of the Mishnah, according to you, would be protecting, in other words, the person who was defrauded was the seller. And according to the Sefer of the Mishnah, the person we're protecting is the buyer. So the Mishnah is imbalanced. You can't have a Mishnah that is half of it talking about one circumstance, and that's all in all shots. The Mishnah has to be uniform. We're talking about one thing, that goes through the entire Mishnah. So if the Mishnah is talking about a mocher being defrauded, then the Sefer should be talking about the mocher has defrauded. And we know in the Sefer, the mocher has no time limit upon which to rectify his damage. So let's flip it around. If the Mishnah is talking about where there is a dedicated time frame, which is what? Either consulting a relative or consulting an expert, then who is that protecting? That's protecting the buyer. Then the ratio has to be talking about protecting the buyer, and that's not the case of our Mishnah. Therefore, says the Gemara is saying, you're wrong. You're wrong when you say the fact pattern is about 24 and 20. It can't be about 24 and 20, which is the mocher being defrauded. It has to be 20 to 24, where the buyer is being defrauded. And if that's the case, then Shmuel can be right, that you can have fraud of money as well as fraud of value. That's what the Gemara scenario is, and therefore the Gemara comes out and says, based on everything we've just said, l'chora, it is a raya to Shmuel that you can have fraud of money in addition to fraud of value, because the facts have to be where it was 24, where it was 24, and he sold it for 20, in which case it's only a 1/5, and you still consider it to be ono. That's sort of going through what's going on here in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. So at this stage, you can say we have shown that Shmuel can be the Tana of our Mishnah, because we have to be talking about a uniform fraud, and the fraud is only the fraud of the buyer. And when is there a fraud of the buyer? When you sell something that's worth 20 for 24. There's no fraud of the buyer when you sell something for 20 that's worth 24. Only the other way around. Okay, so that's our scenario right now. Okay, so I hope that's clear. In other words, that's the fact pattern. That's how we have to come out, that the Gemara is forced to say that our situation in our Mishnah is dafka when he sold something that was worth 20 for 24, in which case ono can be either according to Rav or according to Shmuel. and again, our objective was to say, can Shmuel be the Tana of our, hold like the Tana of our Mishnah? Answer is yes, that he can be the Tana of our Mishnah, because we have to be talking about a case that defrauds the buyer and not the seller. Okay, now let's just go a little bit further. And so now the Gemara wants to say, no, Mishnah, you got it wrong. Okay, and remember, the Mishnah only tells us 1 in 24. It doesn't tell us other facts. It's the Gemara that wants to interpret the Mishnah and say, this is what the Mishnah means when it says 1 in 24. So we thought that it means 1 in 24 because he sold it for 20. Says the Gemara,
1 in
no,
6.
you're making a mistake. We'll go weiter. No, we're talking about a case where something was worth 24 zuz and you sold it for 28, not 20. You sold it for 28. So who is defrauded? The buyer. Now we have a good case of buyer fraud, because the fact pattern of the Mishnah is that you sold something for 24, you sold something for 28 that should only have been 24. Who is that a raya to? That's a raya to Rav, because according to Rav, who says that it has to be based on value, right? So what happened here? The buyer overpaid by 4 zuzim because it was worth 24. He paid 28. So one of 24 of 4 zuzim of 24 of the value is 28. So he overpaid by 4. It's a raya to Rav, right? So look, so that's what the Gemara wants to flip the switch and said, no, it's not a raya to Shmuel because of what you just said that we're defrauding the buyer. If we're actually talking about defrauding the buyer, then the case is 24 to 28, not 24 to 20. Do you see how the Gemara is hopping? We thought that, we have a raya to Shmuel because the case is it was worth 24. He paid 20. That's 1/5. Shmuel says 1/5 is also on. Bingo, the halacha is like Shmuel. I mean, the interpretation like Shmuel. Says the Gemara, not so fast. We're not talking about 24 to 20. We're talking about 24 to 28, which is still a buyer fraud, which is important. Remember, you're talking about buyer fraud, not seller fraud. So it's buyer being defrauded, and he's being defrauded by 4 zuzim because he was upcharged 28, and therefore the halacha is like Rav. So the Gemara says it's no raya from what you just said, that the halacha is like Shmuel. I'm telling you that the halacha is like Rav because he was upcharged by 4. So that's the Gemara's attempt to flip the script and say that the buyer was defrauded by 4 because he paid more than he should have. So the next Gemara is going to go back and wants to. Right now, the mindset of the Gemara is to prove Shmuel right, not Rav. We had this before. Sometimes the Gemara wants to bring several rayas for one side, and if they can't, they give up and say, okay, we tried. So here we tried to prove it like Shmuel. We got thwarted because of the buyer fraud, seller fraud. Now the Gemara is saying, you know what? I'm going to go back and tell you, okay, so now you want to prove that the case is like Shmuel. I'm going to show you it's not like Shmuel because the fact pattern is 24 to 28, not 24 to 20. Okay, now the Gemara, which is going to go weiter, which I think we'll stop here, is going to say, no, the halacha really is like Shmuel because we have a different fact pattern. So this is very interesting with the Gemara, and again, it happens a lot, is that you have these Amoraim who are sitting around the table. They're reading a Mishnah. And Michael, I know you want to have everything tied in a blue ribbon to say, here's the facts. We have the expert next door. Everything is great. And what's the discussion? The teretz is, you're right. If everything was so great, we wouldn't have a discussion. But the Gemara is giving us the ability to have this discussion because the expert was nowhere in sight. If the expert's in sight, you're right, there's no deal, everything is on. But there's no expert. So if there's no expert, what do? Do we go to the buyer, protect him? Do we go to the seller? That's why the Shakla Batari and the Gemara, that's why we have The Mishnah is pretty slim. The Gemara is this wide and wider. Why? Because we have to hypothecate what the Mishnah means. So for every Mishnah, you can have 10, 20, 30 blot of Gemara, because we're taking the words of the Mishnah, we're parsing them, and does it mean this, or does it mean that? We don't know. The Tanaim weren't clear. They just said 1 and 24. But what does 1 and 24 mean? Did it mean 24 to 20, 24 to 28? What did it mean? That's the beauty of learning the Gemara, is that you start with one end and you say, okay, this is the end. But wait a minute, it can't be that, because then we have a discrepancy between buyer and seller, Reisha and Seifa. Okay, let's move on. Let's go now to another fact pattern. It wasn't 24 to 20, it was 24 to 28. If it's 24 to 28, you're right. That's a riot to Rav. Then it's 1/6, because Shmuel doesn't, 24 to 28 doesn't work for Shmuel, because Shmuel would agree with Rav in that case that it's based on valuation. It can't be based on money, because then it's way out of line, right? It's 4 of 28 is 1/7, or whatever it is. If it's 1/7, then no fraud at all. Remember, if it's lower than 1/6, it's a throwaway, according to the Gemara that we're talking about. So this is how the Shakla of the Gemara works. So we tried. The Gemara wanted to say it was like Shmuel. The Gemara said it can't be like Shmuel. The Gemara says it has to be like Shmuel, because if buyer and seller fraud can't be mixed in the Mishnah. So it is like Shmuel. Comes the Gemara and says it's not like Shmuel, because you were wrong. It's not talking about 24 to 20. It's talking about 24 to 28. Shmuel isn't in the picture. It's got to be like Rav. Next week, when we start talking about a different fact pattern, we'll see that the fact pattern fits Shmuel perfectly, and the halacha can be like Shmuel. So Mitchum, next week we'll go through that. But again, Michael made the good point, is that we would have nothing to discuss if every fact that we needed was at hand. Then we wouldn't have an issue. The reason why we have issues is because there was no expert. That opens up the whole horizon to what do we do?
But Rabbi, just one final point.
Yeah.
If I want to avert all this, because I don't want to deal with, I'm a merchant that's, honest, and I want to make sure, if I got a certification from an independent expert that said, I assert that the market value of this is X, between X and Y, and if the person wants to sell at the higher market price, and they said that it would eliminate all this back and forth and the fact to challenge. If I'm a businessman, I don't want to have to be diverted from having to argue all these things, because it takes away from my core business. So it seems to me that you would want to do that to just avoid all of this machlokas.
So you're right. We have evolved over 2,000 years. We're in the 21st century. If you want to sell an item, especially an expensive item, you get a gemologist to give you an expert opinion. And you sit down with the client and you say, here's an expert opinion from a gemologist who everybody recognizes, and this is what it is. So you take the guesswork out of the thing. The problem is, again, we're dealing over 2,000 years ago. There was no expert gemologist, and for most items, who went to an expert to get an expert opinion before you started? We're talking about fruits and vegetables. We're talking about commodities, a sofa, who knows what. People didn't go out of their way to get expert opinions, so that when a person bought, he bought with full confidence. It was a trust relationship between a buyer and a seller. I'm not going to cheat you. You're not going to cheat me. So we do it right. But it turns out that for whatever the reason, it wasn't right. I made a mistake. I was too greedy. I wasn't greedy. I made a mistake. I didn't realize. No one went to experts in advance, Michael, like they do today. But you're right. Your hypothesis is 100% right in the perfect scenario where you went ahead and got all your ducks lined up before you went out into the marketplace. Then you have a very good argument that there should be no retraction, or in other words, shtus shouldn't happen. The problem is shtus happens because people don't do what you're saying. They don't get expert opinions in advance. It's a rule of thumb. Now, what happens, by the way, if the season is bad, there's a frost, and your tomatoes and your oranges and everything else got destroyed, and you're coming into the market and you're selling it at an exorbitant price. And the guy said, wait a minute, a month ago, I paid 4 zuzim. You want me to pay 8 zuzim or 10 zuzim, whatever it is? Okay, now you have the right at that point to show that that's the correct market price. But you can see where in a sort of agrarian society, that becomes a very iffy proposition.
But it's not only the right, you have to do it in that case, because otherwise you're going to be accused of shtus constantly. So it's prevention. I mean, in our society, as Jay mentioned, I mean, it's like you go in understanding you gotta do what you need to do to protect yourselves. These are only in cases where there's egregious overcharging, and quite honestly, a sixth in the realm of things is very minuscule, relatively speaking, to the difference in pricing. So it seems
the only
like
thing I
it's
can
onerous
say is,
on both the buyer and the seller.
Yeah. So again, it's primarily because it's an agrarian economy. I think we're not talking about necessarily hard goods like, no one bought diamonds or this other stuff. So let's say this primarily happened in the agrarian society that they lived in, and the Chachamim obviously saw the need to create a law of Einoah to protect people. And then the Amoraim, when they saw that the Tanoim, which was the halacha, right? The time of the Tanoim. The Tanoim established, Rabbi Hyatt established the halacha. The Tanoim came along and they said, what did the Mishnah, what did Rabbi Hyatt really mean? So now they started debating whether he meant this, or he meant that, or he meant that, or he meant that. So that's how the Gemara began to expand into the discussion, because as a practical matter, people didn't have much to go on. So this whole notion of experts and everything else, that wasn't in their realm of thinking. You bought, you sold, something gnawed at you that you saw your friend spent a lot less money than you did, and you said, wait a minute, maybe I'm not such a smart businessman and I did something wrong. So the Gemara said, we're going to protect you. We're going to give you a small window to undo your ignorance. And we're going to do that by allowing you to go to a relative and go to an expert. Again, to me, the anomaly, which we really have to get into, is why the seller got such a broad swath of protection that he could undo it almost at any time. That's where I think, to me, the real questions lie, which we will get to in a few weeks when we get to that Gemara. But right now, we're dealing with protecting the buyer. So we're focused on what tools does the buyer have for protection. We're saying that he has a window to undo. You see that window was so widely accepted because in Reb Tarfon's scenario, the appraisers who followed Reb Tarfon backed away from Reb Tarfon and said, forget Reb Tarfon, you're wonderful, but we're not following your pattern. We'd rather go with the Chachamim's pattern and of a sixth, which is not in our interest, because we'd rather have a third. A third gives us much more leeway for profit, and we're gonna get into that more in Gemara in detail, hopefully next week, where the Tagrim, the experts of Reb Tarfon, the Chayra, they should really follow Reb Tarfon. But they said, no, Reb Tarfon, very good. We're not following you because you gave the guy too much room to back out. We want to go back to the Chachamim. That's going to be a story unto itself. Very fascinating. But for our purposes, Michael, I think the only thing we can say is that you're pushing for a more perfect setting, and I would agree with you 100%. In that setting, the halacha would be different. But I think what the Gemara is really presenting is the practicality of the time, is that people, the guy came into the village, he was selling, he was wares, everything else. They came, they bought, they sold, and then the guy said, okay, I'm going to the next village. The next village is a mile down the road. He leaves, the guy scratches his head and said, I think I was just duped. And he goes to his relatives, he goes to his, the guy we have somebody who knows this better than I, and all of a sudden he says, yeah, Yitzchak, you were due. So then he now has to quickly go back and follow the seller to the next village and say, I want to undo my deal, or else you give me my money back. That's the reality of life in the 2nd century, or whatever, when the Gemara was written. And that's the reality of what the halacha is. Again, fast forward through the course of time, we see how it's evolved, how the Shulchan Aruch gave us the halachas, and how things developed. And today, it's a total different society. But still, we harken back to the halacha, even though you would say, why do we follow the halacha from 2,000 years ago? If we have a totally different way of doing business today, we shouldn't even be guided by that. The answer is that that's a guide for us to do business today. And even though it's evolved, the halacha still remains the halacha. And we just have to, again, we see that by ribbis that we have had to iska. We see that by mechiras chametz, you're not over bal yimotzei, because you have fixes that the Chachamim gave us, but still the basic halacha remains. So again, we could go on and debate this, but I think for our understanding, we understand sort of the scenario. And next week, the Gemara will pick up to try to give us an understanding of Ishmael right and why he's right, why Oinor can be also Anor's mamim and not damim. And then we're hopefully going to get into the whole sugya of Reb Tarfon versus the Tanakama, that and why when you have Reb Tarfon giving you all of this opportunity to make profit, do you walk away from Reb Tarfon and say, Reb Tarfon, thank you very much, I'm going back to the Chachamim, even though the Chachamim in a 6 gave them much less opportunity. So fascinating Gemaras. So the next week or two, we're going to have some real interesting discussions on this whole sugya. So everybody should have a good week, and hopefully the Shalom on Yisrael, we won't have more suffering as losing our Bnei Yisrael. And